My name is Christina McClellan, and I'm a woman at Iowa.
The Chief Curator at the University of Iowa
Marin,
Museum of Art, and I'm a woman at Iowa.
Gigi Durham. I'm an Associate Professor in the School of Journalism, and I'm a woman at Iowa.
Hello, I'm Karissa Haugeberg, and welcome to Women at Iowa. Today's guest is a distinguished professor of history at the University of Iowa. Her research has considered the history of women, gender, citizenship, and the law in the United States from the early republic to the present. She's admired by students for an original course she teaches on Iowa's history's mysteries. She's also respected by her colleagues for helping to incorporate women's experiences into the narrative of U.S. history. Over the course of her career, she has written 4 books, with a 5th on the way, edited 3 others, and written nearly 50 scholarly articles. In addition to teaching, researching, and writing, Professor Kerber, who is the May Broadbeck Professor in the Liberal Arts at the University of Iowa, has served as the president of the American Historical Association, the American Studies Association, and the Organization of American Historians. Thank you, Professor Kerber, for joining us today.
It's a delight to be here.
Okay, we've had conversations in the past in which you've mentioned that your parents gave you really interesting career advice when you were a young girl. What do you recall that they told you?
I remember being something like 9 years old, maybe 10, at a restaurant with them, which was very unusual. In my day, you did not take a child to a grown-up restaurant. And I was trying to make what I thought was grown-up conversation. And I remember at that time I was enthralled by Cherry Ames' Student Nurse. Mm-hmm. And I was reading them voraciously, and so making conversation, I said something like, when I grow up, I'm going to be a nurse. And I thought that was pretty sophisticated. And it stopped the conversation, and they glared at me. And they said, well, nursing is a good thing, but you can't be a nurse. We won't send you to nursing school. You could be a doctor. We'll send you to medical school. But the problem with nursing is that nurses take orders, mm-hmm. and you can't be anything that you take orders. Mm-hmm. We don't want you taking orders. And I thought that was really interesting. And the conversation went someplace else, and I kind of forgot about it, but I think I kept going back to it. What was it that they were conveying to me about my future? And I only realized many, many years later how unusual that advice was. And it wasn't a denigration of nursing as a career. It was about being a professional, mm-hmm. who could chart their own course. The other thing that I find myself thinking about is that they were very middle-class people. Their parents had been immigrants. My mother was a teacher. My father sold cameras in a camera store. They wanted me to be a professional, but they weren't telling me I had to make a lot of money. Mm-hmm. And when I said I liked writing, when they saw that I was a voracious reader, and I said at some other point maybe I could be a writer, they thought that was a good thing. Mm-hmm. They thought that was a very good thing. And in fact, at some point, my father gave me his thesaurus, and I have his thesaurus. And it's an old one. It's from the 1930s when he got it, when he was in school. And it's much more detailed. It's got many more words. It's much richer than the kind of thing that you poke on a laptop in a program now.
Right. And for your undergraduate education, you attended Barnard, which was a women's-only college. Right. Do you remember why you applied to Barnard? Was that the first time that you were in a single-sex educational setting? Or?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Let's think. I applied to Barnard, and I applied to the Queens College, which is part of what is now the City University of New York. Queens College was free. In those days, there was a belief a public belief in higher education, in which there was a great deal of public faith, that if you educated the next generation, they would make use of it for the good. And it was probably likely that I would go there. But Barnard was a college in the city of New York where we lived, and if my parents scraped and saved their money, and I worked in the summers, we could barely afford, we could manage the tuition. And I did not live on campus because we couldn't afford it. Any place away from home, I would have had to also pay housing. And Barnard was part of the elite Seven Sister Colleges. It was affiliated with Ivy League schools. And so those were my two choices. And I felt very lucky to be accepted at Barnard, where from the very first week, I remember my English professor saying, "You are here, while you are here, you're here to be the best scholars you can possibly be." And the implication was there will be other parts of your life. There will be times for play, there will be dances, there will be athletics. But when you're in my classroom, you're a scholar. And no one had ever said that to me. I thought that was astounding. And it made a difference.
Weren't you called by your last name, Miss Kaufman? And what did that mean to you as a young person?
That was extraordinary. From the very first day at Barnard, I was Miss Kaufman, which was my birth name. And they were Professor Cowenhoven or Tilton. And that elevated me. I was a kid. I was 16 years old. I was an adult. No one had ever called me Miss Kaufman before. In the 1960s, during the great and in many ways remarkable liberation of many of the traditions of academic institutions and the rigidity of our institutions, students conveyed that they wanted to be called by their first names. It was a kind of egalitarian thing. And so now I live in a world in which professors are Professor Kerber, but the students are their first names, which is supposed to make them more comfortable. I've always thought that was a loss. And yet I never had the guts to make my classroom the only place where that happened. And sometimes I look wistfully at that and think, why didn't I try it? Why didn't I try it? But I just don't.
And for people who think that women's history or a course that focuses on gender and women is something modern, something of the 1980s and 1990s, your education demonstrated that that was not the case, that women were central to the way that you learned about the French Revolution or American literature. Can you describe what the curriculum was like at Barnard?
I've always been grateful for Barnard and its curriculum in ways that I could not appreciate at the time. Because they didn't wave flags, they didn't say, we're giving you a different curriculum. But they were raising us. It was very clear. There was a signal. You are to go out and make a difference in the world. We're not wasting our time with you. There will be many ways in which you can make that difference. One of them actually was marrying a diplomat. This is the long 1950s. So in a time when many women were told to find make their lives adjusted to their husbands, well, we were to select the husband very carefully. If you married a diplomat, you would get to go traveling and you might make a difference abroad in our relationships with other countries. But otherwise, it wasn't about merely hanging out. So you were supposed to make a difference. And in the course of that curriculum, I realized, looking back, that when we studied the French Revolution, the women marched on Versailles. And that was part of the story, which was not at that time being told across the street in the history classes at Columbia, or I dare say here in the history classes at the University of Iowa. And when feminists started to reconsider of what we were being taught as our inheritance of Western civilization, we started realizing how much had been erased, how much had been pushed aside, and made recommendations for the transformation of our education, I realized that many of those recommendations, the feminist recommendations of the 1970s, I'd already had. I'd learned about the Women's March on Versailles in my American literature classes. We had read Edith Wharton. We did not need a revolution to teach us that Edith Wharton was a major writer. In our chemistry classes, we were encouraged to think about, do you want to be a doctor? This is a prerequisite for medical school. When we studied languages which were required, there was a message that, of course, you will use these languages. This is not to fulfill a requirement. This is not about checking the box.
Right. And you came of age at a very interesting time in which you were able to observe people who were very deliberately sidelined, or road barriers were put in front of them. People like Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who were just a bit older than you. You were able to observe the difficulties that were intentionally placed before them to prevent them from entering professional careers. Can you describe what you observed coming of age? You were at New York University for a year after Barnard, and then you were at Columbia from 1961 to 1968. What did you observe around you happening to other women trying to enter professional careers?
It's an interesting question. Over the years, I have come to be extremely grateful that I was not 10 years older, because women like Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who came of age perhaps 10 years before me, they got very explicit signals that behaviors that I was encouraged in already were absolutely inappropriate. When Raya Drebin, who is of Ruth Bader Ginsburg's generation and who grew up to be a justice on a court in Boston, in Massachusetts, when she had graduated from Harvard Law School, she had clerked for a major judge in Chicago. She wanted a job, and there were no jobs. There were no jobs for her. And people were quite explicit about it. She was a woman, and she was Jewish. This was in the early 1950s. It was still possible for people who thought of themselves otherwise respectable to say things like that. There were explicit quotas for women. There were explicit quotas for Jews in professional schools. In my graduation group, people who graduated with me, perhaps the most brilliant woman in my graduating class went to graduate school at Columbia in psychology and experimental psychology. And when she came for her oral exam at the end of her master's program, they told her that she could get her master's degree, but she could not go on. She wasn't smart enough. It took her many years to recover from that. Years later, she got a PhD at the University of Chicago. She developed the most distinguished career. She worked with monkeys, which are very, very difficult and dangerous to work with. So I think they couldn't predict of the people who are outsiders, of women, of African Americans for sure. Elite institutions could not predict what these people were capable of.
And just for our students who might be watching today, quotas, it was a system whereby universities would perhaps identify slots for people. They would say that perhaps 10 women could enter a class, 4 Jewish people, 4 African Americans. And so if you look at class pictures over a number of years, you can see almost to a T that these numerical schemas working themselves out as you turn the pages.
Exactly.
So, okay.
Exactly. In my day, it was probably a percentage of Jews, but numbers of African Americans. There were 4 African American women in my class at Barnard of maybe 400, and these are people who prided themselves on making judgments only on intellectual merit. I think now when I look at us, and we have no quotas, but we have experiential barriers. And I think, who are we underestimating? Who's out there who we don't listen hard enough to? Who are we, in ways of which we may not be aware, disencouraging?
Right. Your first academic job was at Yeshiva University, and can you tell us what that was like? It was you were at the time were not an observant Jewish person, and what was that like to step into Yeshiva University?
It was marvelous.
Okay.
It was absolutely marvelous. The Women's College of Yeshiva University, Stern College, was a small college. It was very small. And when I interviewed for the job, the dean said to me, I am not going to ask you anything about your beliefs. I need to know that you will respect what our students believe. And I did respect it. I do respect it. And I've always thought that's the appropriate relationship to have. What I admired most about my time there, what I enjoyed most, what I benefited most, was that at a school with a religious commitment, we never had to, it was always assumed that of course we would think about the moral implications of what we were studying. And in a secular institution where people come from all, which is wonderful and is part of the great inspiriting part of a university like ours, we can't make assumptions about where people in the class are beginning from. So so it's a different spirit when everybody's on the same page and when people are diverse and have different perspectives to bring.
And were you teaching at Yeshiva when your husband was drafted into Vietnam?
Yep.
Okay.
I was.
And when he returned, you moved to Palo Alto, California for a time, and your second son was born there. And then it was in 1971 that you moved to Iowa City. And it was during this period that you noticed that women with whom you'd graduated were struggling to find employment. They were either taking one-year adjunct positions or visiting professorships. Meanwhile, the rest of the profession was blossoming. It was a time when academics as a whole were doing pretty well in finding placement. And it was during this time that learned societies took on a really important role in women's lives, women who chose an academic profession. Can you describe what the role of these learned societies were for women during this period?
Well, when I was in graduate school, I didn't know anything about learned societies. That is to say, gatherings of professionals who meet annually to share research and to consider the state of the profession. The American Historical Association met in New York once when I was in graduate school, and we were all encouraged to go, and we sat in on a couple of sessions that that explained new research, but it was all a blur and confusion, lots of people, lots of books, lots of talk, no idea. Shortly after I arrived here in Iowa City, I got an invitation. I was asked by the American Historical Association, which is based in Washington, D.C., and is a very tiny little office, if I would join a committee that they were establishing, a permanent committee on the status of women. Now, I was not surprised that this committee was being established, because back 2 years before that, in 1969, when my husband had only recently come back from Vietnam, and I'm trying to think, whether I was not yet pregnant or whether I had just stopped being pregnant and our second child was born. But I went to a meeting of the American Historical Association in Boston. And at the business meeting that one evening, they heard a report from an ad hoc committee on the status of women, which women historians had asked the association to establish. And in that room, Willie Lee Rose, a very diminutive, short person, a very distinguished historian of the American South and of slavery, stood before this enormous audience and presented the report of a committee that she had chaired that reported on the status of women. And what they basically had come up with was that in a profession that believed it chose people on the basis of their minds and their intellect, when they examined the history departments in big public universities, in large elite universities like Harvard and Yale, in small colleges like Carleton and Swarthmore, there were hardly any women teaching in these departments, even though at the time something like 15% of the PhDs in history went to women. And we were asked to do something about it. So the result was a permanent committee. We were asked to do something on it. I was part of that very first committee. We sat around in Washington, not quite sure what our agenda would be, how we could help, but within a few months, the committee started getting mail. And we got the most extraordinary. We got letters from women who said, "I'm so glad you exist. I have been teaching in my department for 6 years, and so in the normal course of affairs, I'd be evaluated for tenure, and I've just discovered that a group of senior faculty men stood together on a staircase landing and said, 'You think she's ready for it?' Nah." And that's the end of my chance for tenure. We learned of women who did not dare have children, lest they be regarded as unprofessional.
And weren't women who were applying for jobs frequently interviewed in hotel rooms that had beds?
They were interviewed in hotel rooms that had beds. They were asked whether they were married. They were asked whether, if they were married, they planned to have children. The best answer to that in that situation, can you believe it, was no. The very best answer was, "Alas, I am incapable of having children." The intrusiveness, the intensity of those expectations strike me now as immoral and not only discourteous, but immoral and crude. And yet they were commonplace. They were commonplace in the profession. And so within very short order, we had an agenda. We had a list of best practices. We were a place to complain to. We were a group that could say to the profession, do you notice that 15% of the people in the profession are women, but no woman has served on the editorial board of the American Historical Review for 20 years? Have you noticed that?
Well, and it seems to me that the Learned Society enabled you to go from anecdotal evidence to a large base of data that you were able to demonstrate by looking at private colleges, women's colleges, public universities, that across the board this was a problem, that it wasn't just individual women at individual institutions suffering from these policies.
I think that's absolutely right. It's a great insight. And simultaneously, feminists all over the country were asking their institutions to do studies of their institutions. And when I got here in 1971, Sandy Boyd had asked this university, or had started this university, on its own inquiry into gender equity as practiced here. So I had this new job. I was very thrilled to have it. I thought that I had had very serious conversations, very serious negotiating conversations about my salary when I started. I was hired by a man who was himself a feminist, who was himself very anxious to recruit me and to give me a good deal. And yet, what Sandy Boyd asked for was what they called paired studies, in which they measured women against someone else in their department who had the same number of years of experience and had published, done something comparable in their research. And when they did this paired measure, guess what? I got a $1,000 raise And that was at a time when my salary was $13,000, which was a good salary for an assistant professor in 1971. That's a big amount of money to have lost control of because people weren't paying attention. So that our understanding, and I would say also that in the context of these studies, which are ongoing, and in fact, I was on a gender equity task force here at this university only a couple of years ago. The context for them, I've always thought, is we have a co-ed student body. We are teaching our students the same kind of stuff. No one tells girls, we've accomplished a great deal. No one tells little girls they can't be engineers. No one tells girls there are quotas for them in medical school, right? But when these students look at their future, what am I going to be when I grow up? What am I going to be when I go out of here? Am I going to be able to have a career, a fulfilling career, professional life? They are encountering a situation that is different than it was in 1971, but only because people have worked very, very hard to change it, and not nearly as different as it needs to be. So the work that we started, we need to continue. And the learned societies were easier to do it in. They didn't have a lot of institutional investment in things as they were. And our own individual academic institutions have been harder to shift, but the learned societies have been able to take a role in articulating what the shift would be.
I think a student of your career would see how the resurgent feminism of the 1960s and 1970s not only had a profound influence on the way that people thought about jobs and hiring and pay, but also it was very important for an intellectual invigoration within the academy. And even in your own work in 1970, your first book was published, Federalists in Dissent, Intellect and Ideology in Jeffersonian America. And in that book, you had about 3 paragraphs devoted to women and children, which were solid paragraphs, very good paragraphs. But the resurgent feminism of the period, it led you to think that there was more to that story. And in a sense, you spent the next 10 years thinking about women and the rhetoric of gender that was deployed in the early American period. Can you describe what was happening intellectually during that period? It was a rich period of feminist scholarship. What sorts of questions were starting to be asked? How were people looking at books that had been written and questioning what had been left out, perhaps?
Yeah. I've always looked back on my defense, my dissertation defense, where those 3 paragraphs on women and children exist. Someplace Alexander Hamilton says we can't find people to staff our factories because life is too good for men here. They can get land and they have opportunities. But it's women who are stuck, women who are desperate. We can hire desperate women and children in our factories. Well, this is really a serious thing. I wrote 3 paragraphs about it. Nobody at my defense said, hey, Linda, those are really interesting paragraphs. That's a really scary piece of the early republic, of the generation of the founding fathers that you found. Would you think about writing more about that? And it took, it was only when, and they didn't. So it stayed in the book, 3 paragraphs. It was a revived feminist movement in which all over the country people were saying, tell us about women. And women were hungry for their history. They were beginning to say, well, wait a minute, what were we not told? In 1971, and this has always struck me as so remarkable, it is not until 1971 that the U.S. Supreme Court said that on occasion it was possible that discrimination on the basis of sex could be discrimination and prejudicial. Up to then, discrimination on the basis of sex was helping the little ladies find their place. So you're right, those years of 71 to 75, all of the 70s are quite dynamic and exciting and revolutionary times, really, in our understanding of who we were. And the public wanted to hear women's history. So even when institutions didn't reward it, ladies' clubs, leagues of women voters invited us to come and tell us of their findings. Now, I need to say that the University of Iowa was under the leadership of Sandy Boyd and May Broadbeck, who was then the provost, were remarkably ahead of the flow in this moment. When I thought to teach a course in women's history, which had not been taught here except in what was called action studies by a graduate student and is now what we call Saturday and evening classes. But there had been nothing in the regular curriculum. Nobody asked me to defend it. The only question I was asked was, do you want to teach on Tuesday, Thursday, or Monday, Wednesday, Friday? And none of my colleagues in other institutions across the country had such an easy time of it. So it was a time when a demand could be responded to.
Throughout your career, you've contributed your professional perspective to contemporary issues. For example, you've contributed to several historians' briefs. First, could you tell our audience what a historian's brief is? What is the function of a historian's brief?
In the a historian's brief is actually a form of a concept called an amicus brief. Amici, this is Latin for friend, and this is a statement of 20 pages or so, prepared by people who understand themselves to be friends of the court at a time when a court, and it could be the Iowa Supreme Court, it could be a court in any state, it could be the U.S. Supreme Court. A court is undertaking to consider a judgment, not at a trial, but a case has been, an outcome has been appealed to an appellate court. They are considering what their judgment will be. And the concept is that they will take information, if you have something to help them, if you might have some information that would be useful to them as they consider the situation, there's a form in which it can be offered. Strictly speaking, an amicus brief should not take sides, although often they do, at least by implication. They're offered by people who want one outcome or another. But while you're writing it, you are not supposed to take sides. You are to be neutral observers. And on occasion in recent years, well, historians traditionally got involved in such a situation, often when they were historians who knew something about Indian history, the history of Aboriginals in the United States. There were cases involving Indians and their claims to land, and historians who had studied those treaties back in the 19th century could offer some useful information to a court now. In recent years, historians of women and historians of reproductive rights have found that when the court deliberates on some of these issues, that some of what we've learned from the past could be helpful.
And sometimes there's a fuzzy understanding of historical concepts. For example, birthright citizenship. It's very common to hear people say that their relatives immigrated legally. Why can't people do that today? And historians have been able to offer a more nuanced understanding of citizenship and how it hasn't always been that the standards by which we evaluate terms like citizenship have changed over time. So could you explain how historians were able to inform understandings about, for example, same-sex marriage, that, for example, ideas about sexuality have not always been the same?
one of the kinds of cases in which historians have regularly filed briefs, not in all, but in many, have been issues of same-sex marriage. The first historian's brief in such a case was filed in Goodrich versus Personnel Administrator, Health Department of Massachusetts, as the Supreme Judicial Court of Massachusetts considered what it would do. And the brief was drafted by two historians who study marriage and the family very seriously. And I was one of the group to whom they turned for assistance and consultation. So we all signed the brief. And we wrote a little history of marriage in the United States as it's developed in the United States, because people who oppose same-sex marriage often said, or maybe we'll just say that it's often said, marriage has always been the same thing over time. From time immemorial, marriage has not changed. Well, historians understand that in the United States, marriage has changed. At the time of the Revolution, when when two people married, the husband instantly got absolute access to the body of his wife. There was no concept of rape in marriage. She might bind him over to keep the peace, but that was pretty tricky. Mostly, he had absolute access to her body. And if he had absolute access to her body, of course he had control over the money she brought to the marriage and the money she earned during it. And of course you wouldn't give her a vote, because he could so easily blackmail her into voting the way he did, that to let married women vote was to give husbands a double vote. Well, that system has been changed. We no longer give husbands absolute access to the body of their wife. We have a concept of rape in marriage, and a crime. It is a crime. And married women can hold on to property in their own name if they choose to. That's changed over time. Throughout the 19th century, in many states, there were laws of calling marriage between white people and people of other races, and sometimes even ethnicities, miscegenation, and made it illegal. And it is not until 1965 that the Supreme Court ruled in the case of Loving versus Virginia, a wonderfully named case, that miscegenation laws were a denial of equal protection of the law. And at that time, 13 states still had such statutes. So we don't do that anymore. And that was a way of thinking about marriage that historians have long understood, and that we thought it would be useful for a court to have. And in fact, Margaret Marshall made some use of this brief when she wrote her opinion, her majority opinion, in Goodrich upholding same-sex marriage, in the first state to do that.
And it's interesting that there's something unsettling in what historians can do, in the sense that stories that seem simple, that seem straightforward, often are not. And I see that throughout your career, even the notion that women's history was invented relatively recently, and we now know that that isn't the case, that there was a deliberate attempt to suppress it in the 1950s. And we even see this today. More recently, from 2005 to 2008, you served on the Provost Task Force on Gender Equity at the University of Iowa. And in May of 2006, the task force came out with a report about the state of gender at the University of Iowa. And it wasn't all rosy. It wasn't necessarily a story of progress, 100%. Can you describe what some of the findings were of that report?
Yeah, I think the committee was started in 2006, and I think our report is 2008.
Okay.
But we worked, it was very interesting. It was what some people would call a blue ribbon committee. Adrienne Wing of the law school, very senior professor at the law school, chaired it. The other members were very accomplished members of the faculty. We worked very hard. Some of us, the ones with skills in data and data management, worked harder than the rest of us, I think. And we wrote a very serious report that surprised us and surprised the then provost to whom we presented it. And surprised us because, as I've said, in the 1970s, University of Iowa was way ahead. We were a lantern showing the way toward gender equity issues. And we've accomplished an enormous amount, and so has American higher education. We've done what sociologists would say, fixed the pipeline. But we wanted to know what issues exist for faculty now, with the understanding that whatever the faculty experienced would probably have its variations for staff and for students, but we could grab hold of faculty. And we found some things that unsettled us. We found that the growth of women on the faculty is not anywhere near keeping up with the growth of PhDs that women in the nation have been earning in the various fields. We learned that in the two largest colleges in the university, the medical school and the College of Liberal Arts, the attrition rate for junior faculty and for junior mid-career, if you want, young associate professors, is very high, is stunningly high. It's much higher than the attrition rate for male faculty. And then when we looked around at our peer institutions, we saw that the institutions we think of as the ones that we compete with for faculty recruitment have thought more productively about what faculty members need in order to have a good professional life. And I say faculty members and not just women, because having children, for example, is something that enriches the lives of both men and women, both fathers and mothers. But we still have a structure in which the burdens of mothering are largely laid on women. So many of our peer institutions now have paid maternity leave. We do not. If there's any pay, it comes out of sick leave, which of course hurts women down the road in their careers. We don't have paid maternity leave. We don't have a robust system of parenting leave. We don't have a robust system in which we readjust programs and readjust teaching responsibilities so that people, men and women, can be parents and professionals at the same time. And what that led us to understand is it's not just about children. If you think of the full panoply of private life, nobody gets out of this world unburdened. Whether or not you have children, the chances of having a close relationship with a person who has a serious psychiatric problem, who is suicidal. People have elderly men and women have elderly parents who develop dementias, needing attention. We don't have a robust system for enabling all of us to have a professional life and a personal life. And I think that it's pretty clear that this is what the agenda for, now that we have our degrees, how are we going to use them? The university should be ahead of the game on this one. Some universities are, some public universities even are. Some public universities who are not wealthy, I don't think any public university these days is wealthy, but they're doing better than we are. And we should not be sending this signal. I would say one other piece of this that I care about a great deal and it matters under the heading of how do these junior women who are drifting out. I sat around a table not that long ago with a group of mid-career women who were in their late 30s. They were assistant professors, associate professors, and most of them had one child. And all of them had had medicalized pregnancies. And I realized that on one side of the river in the OBGYN department, we teach our residents that the chances of problems, of birth defects, of problematic pregnancies increase sharply after the age of 30. But our structures on this side of the river discourage women, young families from forming, discourage people from shaping their reproductive lives as they would independently of. So I'm here to say, let us not do that. Let us not do that. And I think, just to sort of get back to the research, that my ability to think about these questions in this way is deeply related to the research that I've done and the history that I write. Because the fact that so little attention has been paid to the meanings of women's lives, the complexities of women's experience, the assumption that what men experience can stand for women's experience, all that, in a funny way, was great opportunity for historians of women. We've got lots of stuff nobody paid attention to or hasn't paid attention to since the 1920s, when the first wave of feminists engendered by the suffrage movement started attending to the history of women. Actually, Elizabeth Cady Stanton addressed her generation and said, in effect, ladies, save your papers, there's history here to be written. So that as I work harder and learn more about the complexities of women's experience, I've understood that generalizations that have been made about men can't stand for generalizations about women. When I wrote No Constitutional Right to Be Ladies, I basically took on an assumption that we know the history of rights in America, we know the history of obligations, but in fact, the history of rights is men and women. Everyone knows men and women get to vote at different times. Men and women of different races get to vote at different times, get rights at different times. But there's also a history of obligation, of the obligations that we owe to the state, of loyalty, of paying taxes, of serving on juries, of serving in the military. And that history has a different set of controls for men and for women. And I think I came to that, and this gets back to something you mentioned, but I don't want to lose. You mentioned that my husband was drafted into Vietnam. He was a physician, and medical people of his generation could not easily avoid being drafted. And so he served in the Delta and in Vietnam in 1967-68. It was a very tough year for Americans. And I think, and we are still very much, I think in some ways, people who are shaped by that experience. And I think when I emerged from it many years later, but in the back of my head I was wondering, how is it that a government that I understood to be my government can take us and say, I'm going to put your body in harm's way? I learned in doing that research that it's long been a principle that the government has the power to put women's bodies in harm's way. That if the state should decide to draft women, there's no intellectual reason they could not. It's just a choice of Congress. And I began to think hard about what power the state has over us, and learned that for much of American history, American women may not have necessarily owed obligations directly to the state, but they owed them to their husbands. And their husbands had authority over them. And it was not only authority over their bodies, They could be beaten. It was an authority over their finance, authority over their will. So that when we see disparities now in the situation of women, as in their education, in their ability to make claims, in their presence in Congress, that's not because feminists failed in the last 30 years. That's because we're still working on an agenda that is as old as this country and that was articulated sharply by Elizabeth Cady Stanton in 1848. Those ingredients are still there. They're still alive, and they're still there for us to work on.
Okay. And I don't want this interview to end without talking about your course, Iowa's History's Mysteries. It's a class that's gotten a lot of fanfare among history majors at the University of Iowa, and even non-history majors have started taking this course. And it concludes each semester with a symposium at the State Historical Society. And I've had the privilege of attending this. These are open to the public each semester. Can you describe what students do in this course?
Marvelous. I love this course, and I wish I had thought of it years ago. Because what I do basically is turn students loose. We have in Iowa City 3 great resources of archives, of manuscript material, of stuff. The Iowa Women's Archives, which was funded and endowed by the great feminist Louise Noun. The special collections here at the university, also special collections, which has been collecting papers of Iowans ever since I think there's been a library, and the State Historical Society, the great State Historical Society on Iowa Avenue, now struggling with state funding because I think not enough people understand how great and rich a resource it is. And we bring the students to each of these, all 3. And the archivists, the wonderful archivists there, Mary Bennett at the State Historical Society, Karen Mason at Iowa Women's Archives, Dave McCartney here at the university, introduce them to samples of some of the remarkable materials we have here. And everybody realizes nobody's ever written about this. You could pull a box out at random. The reason that Americans know Americans tell their history through events in Massachusetts, think the Boston Tea Party, and Virginia, think Patrick Henry, California, think the Gold Rush. Why don't they tell it through Iowa? Because they don't know, because people haven't written that history. So I turn the students loose. These are sophomores and juniors. They have no experience in research. We help them, we hover over them, but we help them find whatever they're interested in, And they come up with the most remarkable contributions to Iowa history. Let me think of...
There's an example of someone who wrote a paper about the interstate system going through Des Moines and taking out what had been a historically African-American neighborhood. And what I found as a person of the audience was you could just see the excitement in his voice and how something clicked with him. And that he understood that the story of the interstate seems like a national story. It's the Eisenhower administration. But it had very profound implications for people in Iowa. There were issues of race and class and whose voice was heard, who made the decision to put that interstate in.
Absolutely. Tyler Denton had been driving. He was from Des Moines. He'd been driving on I-235 for years.
Yeah.
And when, I forgot how we got to it, but when I said, well, where the interstate was placed might have some choices were made, might have a history. And when he found out that the decision about the route was run by a planning and zoning committee that had 3 people on it, and 2 of them voted for the route that was proposed, and one of them, and they lived far away from Des Moines. They lived an hour out of Des Moines, and the one guy who lived in Des Moines said, "This is going to be a disaster. We should not do that." When Tyler found that out, nobody had said that. Nobody knew that. That's extraordinary. That's absolutely extraordinary.
And I wonder if a historian from out of state would have understood that significant moment in that story. Yeah.
No. And they also found that in the boxes of papers collected by women that are in the women's archives are all sorts of material about husbands who wrote to them, or organizations of which they were a part, so that the papers of, for example, the Davenport Catholic Interracial Council are in the papers of a woman who left them, whose husband was active in it, she was active in it, she's got the newsletters, they're in the Iowa Women's Archives. So you can't say, I'm not interested in women, I'm not going there. Right. And that was also a really significant experience. And one student wrote a really interesting paper about the work of the Catholic Interracial Council in the 50s. One student found two nuns one of whom got arrested for working for migrant workers and on behalf of migrant workers, and he has Sister Molly Munoz's arrest record in his paper. Who knew? Who knew?
Well, one thing that your scholarship has done is you've always asked serious and difficult questions that have helped us to see that simple stories are rarely ever simple when you begin to peel away the layers, and that they're often much more fascinating than anyone could believe. They can be unsettling, they can be inspiring, and I think that this is a gift that you've given your students. You ask them to ask these serious and difficult questions about Iowa's history. And so I'd like to thank you for joining us today, and it's just been a delight to have you on the program. So thank you.
Karissa.
And again, my name is Karissa Haugeberg. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Women at Iowa.